Do you like sports? Do you like art? What about science? Giraffes? Giraffe scientists that paint rugby games? It's all available on Audible, the biggest audiobook site with the largest selection of audiobooks this side of the inner solar system. No need to use your boring old eyes anymore. The ears are the future, my friend. Why, you're using them right now. So check out Audible and get your listen on. Go to www.readlearnlivepodcast.com/audible to start your 30-day free trial today.
What I object to and what I'm concerned about is the tendency of many people within the field of evolutionary psychology to overstate things, basically to make up just so stories for why we human beings do what we do, based on flimsy evidence or basically, or more properly based on speculation based in the principles of evolution.
Hello and welcome to Read, Learn, Live, the podcast about improving yourself through literature. I'm your acclaimed host, John Monaster, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 36, the one where spring has finally sprung. As always, if you have ideas for books you'd like to see featured, or of authors you want to put me in touch with, you can reach me at jon@readlearnlivepodcast.com. Today, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak with author Ken Miller about his book, The Human Instinct. Kenneth Miller is professor of biology at Brown University and the critically acclaimed best-selling author of Only a Theory, Finding Darwin's God, and The Human Instinct. He serves as a science advisor to the NewsHour on PBS and is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Among his honors are the Stephen Jay Gould Prize from the Society for the Study of Evolution, the Laterre Medal from Notre Dame University, and the Award for Public Engagement with Science from the American Association for the Advancement of Science. I hope you enjoy our conversation as much as I did. All right, everyone, and welcome to the Read, Learn, Live podcast. This is your host, John Monaster. I am here with Ken Miller. Ken, say hello.
How you doing?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing fine. Happy to be here.
Excellent. Yeah, happy to have you. I'm really excited. I've got your book here, my right hand, The Human Instinct, How We Evolved to Have Reason, Consciousness, and Free Will. This is an absolutely fascinating book that delves deep into all sorts of scientific questions about who we are and non-scientific questions about who we are, maybe deeper questions. But I always like to start off with kind of in your own words, just summarize what the book is all about.
I think the quickest summary of what the book is all about is how should we human beings understand ourselves in light of what we know about ourselves and our origins from modern science? And, I started the book out rhetorically by asking the reader in the very first paragraph, stories matter. And once we had one. And I think most readers in the U.S. would think of the biblical story of Adam and Eve, about the creation of human beings, but I mean stories more broadly. And I made reference to the Navajo origin story of the Dene, as the Navajo call themselves, of first man and first woman moving up from the third world into the fourth world. And there are other creation stories in other cultures and other religious traditions. But ultimately, every culture you can think of has an origin story. And what happened, of course, in the 19th century is that our story got upended. And by our story, I mean all of humanity's story. And it was upended by, of course, the theory of evolution and the realization that we, like every other living thing on this planet, evolved. And given that understanding, what I want to know and what I wanted to inquire about in the book is how should we understand ourselves? How should we look at our own species? What are we to make of this? And ultimately, what does it mean?
Yeah. Really easy questions, easy answers, right?
This book has only been out for a week, and I've only had a couple of opportunities to speak publicly about the content of the book. And in both cases, I've started off by quoting a couple lines from the eighth Psalm. And there's a wonderful line in there which goes, "What is man that thou art mindful of him?" And the eighth Psalm then provides an answer. And that is that thou hast created him, meaning mankind, a little lower than the angels and given us dominion over the earth. So the wonderful thing about the biblical certainties is it answered who we were, a little lower than the angels. What are we supposed to do? We're supposed to take charge of this planet. And I think that was comforting. All of those old certainties were upended by the theory of evolution. Evolution shaped not only our bodies, but it shaped our minds. It affected our behaviors, our wants, our desires. And therefore, how are we to understand ourselves? And there are several narratives that many people have advanced. One sort of narrative that you often see in the popular culture, and I try to explore this as well, is that the news that we are evolved creatures can be pretty depressing in one way or another. I often hear people who dispute evolution say the reason they don't like it is because it tells us that we are just animals. Well, we're animals. The alternative being we could be plants, we could be fungi, we could be bacteria. I'm going with animals, okay? But the word that's wrong in that phrase is just animals or mere animals. We're animals to be sure. And many of the qualities that we possess are also possessed by other animals. But the collection of characteristics and properties that we possess is like no other living organism. And, in recent years, even geologists have come to realize that something special happened when the human species appeared on this planet and when it took charge of the planet. And I say take charge, meaning for better or for worse. We are now the dominant land mammal on this planet. 20,000 years ago, that wasn't true, but that certainly is true now. We are everywhere. We're approaching 9 billion of us. 20, 30,000 years ago, there might have been only a few 10,000s of us on this planet. And they've come to refer to the age in which we're living as a new geological age that is called the Anthropocene. And some people might pronounce it as the Anthropocene. And what that word means when you break down the roots is the age of human beings. Because we not only dominate the planet, but we affect its ecology, its biology, and even its geology. So under those circumstances, we really are a significant species. This planet changed when our species came of age. And it's very important to understand who we are and what to make of that change.
Yeah, agreed. And so before we delve deep into all the issues of the book, I always like to briefly chat about sort of the creative process of writing a book. I always think that's interesting and can sometimes be helpful to understand. So just briefly, how did you get interested in all these issues? And I know you've written some other books, so maybe tie that in with your other academic or creative pursuits.
Well, I'm going to, if you don't object, I'm going to go back pretty far. I'm a cell biologist. I was fascinated with microscopes as a kid. And I could email you a photo of me taken on my 11th birthday in the basement of my parents' house in New Jersey, sitting at a table in front of a Gilbert chemistry set with all these chemical compounds, and my birthday gift that year, which was a little microscope. And in a way, it's my first laboratory, and I'm like 11 years old. I have a larger microscope now. I have a somewhat larger laboratory. But I've thought of myself as a scientist and actually as a biologist ever since I was in 6th or 7th grade. And the field I went into is cellular biology, in part because I was fascinated by the electron microscope. And most of my research work involves the structure and function of biological membranes, membrane proteins, how energy from certain forms like light energy is transformed into chemical energy by the process of photosynthesis and some other basic processes. When I came to Brown, where I teach now, 38 years ago, in 1980, I started teaching introductory biology, in addition to courses in my specialty, simply because I enjoy generalizing and I enjoy basically trying to tie all of biology together. I was challenged by a group of students who were hosting a critic of evolution, a so-called scientific creationist, to come to campus, and I was challenged to debate him. And after a lot of reluctance, I said, okay, I'll debate this guy. Now, your listeners may not believe this, but I swear it's true, and I can give you the newspaper article references. The debate took place in April of 1981, and the reason it drew such a large crowd was because two American states, Louisiana and Arkansas, had just passed laws requiring the teaching of so-called creation science in the biology classroom, and neither law had been tested in the courts yet. So a lot of people wondered, maybe this is a great new scientific field. The students sold tickets for about $1 a piece because they had some expenses to defray. And when they sold 300 tickets, they had to move it to, large lecture hall. When they sold over 500, they had to switch that to an auditorium. And finally, when they sold well over 1,000, they had to move the debate to the largest room on our campus, which is the ice hockey rink. Oh. So I debated Henry Morris in front of, no kidding, more than 2,000 people. And I was just a young, wet behind the ears assistant professor. And I was stunned at the intensity of interest that people had in the questions about evolution. And the debate was marvelous. I was terrified, because I'm not really an evolutionary biologist. I was terrified of debating this guy. So I got audio tapes of his old debates. I read his books. I made one 35 millimeter slide after another, dissecting every one of his arguments. And I showed those slides at the debate, and boy, were they effective. And I acquired a reputation as an effective creationist debater. And therefore, in the early 1980s, I actually participated in several debates. I wrote articles defending the theory of evolution specifically, and defending particularly the teaching of evolution in the schools. And at the same time, and this is coincidental, a former student of mine called me up, and this could be a really long story, I'll make it short. He talked me into doing something absolutely insane, which was writing a high school biology textbook with him. It took about 8 years for that book to come out. It was finally published in 1990. It had the catchy title. It was called Biology. And it's known as Biology by Miller and Levine. His idea, the reason my name is first, is I won the coin flip. To our very great astonishment, that book took off. And since 1980, I think we've gone through 5 editions. The latest is out this year. And it has been, in almost every one of the years since, the best-selling high school biology textbook in the United States. Now, where I'm going with this is something I didn't expect. And that is, even though I was used to dealing with the arguments of creationists, when that textbook came out, because it has a very strong treatment of evolution as the centerpiece of everything in biology, it was immediately attacked by people who really didn't want evolution taught in the schools around the country. So almost as a matter of self-defense, I found myself drawn back into defending evolution per se and the teaching of evolution. The other thing I found out almost right away was that almost everybody who objects vehemently to the theory of evolution does so for religious reasons, because they believe evolution is inherently anti-religious. Now, the first time I encountered that, I was really sort of surprised, because I was brought up in a Roman Catholic household. I am still a practicing Catholic. I know very well that if you go to colleges and universities around the country that are affiliated with the Catholic Church, think Notre Dame, think Loyola University, think Georgetown, think Boston College, Holy Cross, you'll find departments of evolutionary biology in every single one of them. So it came as a shock to me that people would think that somehow evolution contradicts the Christian faith. Gradually, I realized for an awful lot of people it does. And I decided that for the first time, I had now had some experience as a textbook author, and I was deluded into thinking maybe I could actually write. And I approached the literary agent that my co-author Joe Levine and I have been working with, and I floated the idea of a trade book on religious objections to evolution. And he was enthusiastic about that. He said, man, there'd be an audience for that. And that book became my first trade book, called Finding Darwin's God, a scientist's search for common ground between God and evolution. And you might say in that book, I came out of the closet as a Christian. And the reason I put it that way is because it was very obvious to anybody who reads it that it was written by a person of faith. That had never crept into my textbook, any of my scientific writings, no reason for it to. But in that book, I didn't try to write a reasons to believe book. What I tried to do was to explain, first of all, the scientific standing of the theory of evolution, the reason the scientific community finds it so persuasive, and in addition, try to explain why and how people of faith could accept evolution and understand it in a religious context. A few years after that book was published, I ended up testifying in a very highly publicized federal trial in Pennsylvania called Kitzmiller versus Dover. And this was a trial on the teaching of so-called intelligent design in the schools. Intelligent design is sort of like creationism 2.0, sort of scrubbed up and designed to appear non-religious, but in fact, of course, it really is. I was the lead witness in that trial. My testimony went on for 2 days, but the trial itself went on for 7 weeks. We won the case. When I say highly publicized, I'm not kidding about it. 4 books were written about the trial and 2 TV documentaries, one by the BBC and one by Nova in the United States called Judgment Day. The Nova documentary actually won the Peabody Award for broadcast journalism.
So who played you in the documentary?
Well, there's a couple things here. One is I do appear in the documentary in terms of interviews and backgrounds and so forth.
Okay.
But as you know, cameras are not allowed in federal courtrooms. All you ever get is like a courtroom sketch. Mm-hmm. And the Nova people felt that there were certain really dramatic moments during the trial when they had to kind of like reenact it. So they hired actors and they reenacted them. And I honestly don't know the name of the actor who played me. The one thing I can tell you is I really did not like his performance. And the reason I didn't like the script, of course, was verbatim from the trial transcript. But for some reason, this actor thought he knew what a college professor at an Ivy League school sounds like. And where I would have said, yes, the evidence for evolution is overwhelming, he would sit back and say, why, yes, the evidence for evolution is overwhelming, with what you might call like a faux British accent. I mean, he wanted, I sound New Jersey, and he wanted to sound Oxford and Cambridge. And, what the heck? But it was an extraordinary program. And later on, I wrote another trade book that dealt with some of the political issues around why Americans reject evolution more than the citizens of any other industrialized country. And that book was called Only a Theory, Evolution and the Battle for America's Soul. And at that point, I figured, okay, I've done much else to write about. I'm going to go back to the lab, back to my teaching, and back to textbooks. But over the next few years, and this is why I wrote the book that we're talking about right now, I began to realize that there's an image of what evolution means in the popular culture that many, many people accept. They feel they have to accept it because that's what science says. But that image is sort of demeaning and depressing. It basically tells us, first of all, that we are indeed animals, that we're driven by base desires shaped by evolution, but over which we have no intellectual control, that what we reason in terms of ethical values, moral values, and principles, these are not authentic. These are simply the values that were imprinted on us during our evolutionary history by the raw demands of reproduction and survival. And there are even arguments that consciousness itself is an illusion, that we are really not conscious beings. We are automatons, that we lack free will, that when we think we make a judgment, it's actually dictated by what you might call the raw calculus of evolution. And at the beginning of this book, the new book that just came out, I quoted one of America's greatest writers, someone whom I enormously admire. And this is the novelist and essayist Marilynne Robinson. She's a Pulitzer Prize winner for Gilead, which is a great novel that I would recommend to anyone. She's followed it up with several other books, so there's now a Gilead Trinity. She also is a persuasive and eloquent essayist on modern culture and intellectual life. And in a book called The Death of Adam, she wrote a long essay on what she called Darwinism. And she doesn't object to evolution. She's not a creationist, but rather she finds what she calls Darwinism to be an ideology that is supported by the science of evolution, that demeans human beings, that denies us a soul in the broadest sense, and I don't just mean in the religious sense, and ultimately even denies us our own individuality. And she finds that really depressing and a corrosive force on modern culture. And I also quoted from a wonderful novel called Saturday by the great British novelist Ian McEwan. And I can't go into the whole plot of Saturday. It's a wonderful book, and it's really, really worth reading. It's very thought-provoking. But there's a point at which the protagonist in that novel over and over again is thinking of his situation in life, and he repeats over and over again the word grandeur, grandeur, grandeur. And he takes it from the final sentence of The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. And that final sentence begins, "There is grandeur in this view of life." Well, in that last sentence, Darwin tried to say what a great vision evolution really was. But the protagonist of the novel Saturday says, almost sarcastically, yeah, grandeur. Evolution gave us war, famine, death. That's the grandeur. And all we have to show for it is consciousness for a brief period of time. That's some grandeur. And again, not an evolution denier, but someone who thinks that the cultural impact of evolution really tells us a story we'd rather not hear about ourselves. And I began to think, well, there's no question that is a very common cultural conception of what evolution means. But as a scientist, that's not what the science of evolution tells us at all. This point of view simply comes from certain people with particular cultural views, political views, and social views, using evolution to justify them, when in fact, I would argue that what evolution really tells us is a story that we should be proud of. Evolution is the source of our humanity. It's the source of our creativity. It gave us the ability to do art and music and compose literature. And it also gave us the ability to create the discipline that we call science, by which we discovered evolution itself. And I think that's something to be, if not proud, certainly to be optimistic about.
Yeah, and I think that's the message that gets across in the book. So talk a little bit about your writing process. So you've written a lot. You've written these textbooks. You've written several other trade books. What was it like putting the book together? Did you follow the same kind of methods you used before? Did you do something new this time? What was it like writing?
Basically, I'd say about 4 years ago, I started thinking that I wanted to write a book along these lines. And when I do this, the first thing I do is to sketch out a series of topics. Like, what are the topics I really want to cover? And I knew I wanted to tell readers about some of the new and powerful evidence in the human genome that confirms our relationship with other creatures and really nails down the fact that we were produced by the evolutionary process. And I wanted to make it sort of impossible to come to grips with evolution by denying it. Then I knew I wanted to go on and ask a couple of questions. One is, does the evolutionary process that created us, does it imprison us intellectually? In other words, are our drives, desires, and even our reasoning powers simply dictated by evolution to the point where we don't have any control over them? And I also wanted to address how evolution shaped our minds. Evolution obviously gave us our brains, like every other organ we have. But in so doing, did it give us a flawed reasoning instrument that leads us astray? In other words, are we really not smart enough to figure out who we are or what the world is like? And then I wanted to address other issues related to that, such as consciousness and free will. And then lastly, I wanted to come back on that issue of, are we just an animal, or is there something really unique and really important in the 4.5 billion year history of this planet? Did something really important happen when human beings appeared? So those are sort of the big topics. And then what I do in terms of writing process is I try to take those big topics and figure out, okay, how many chapters do I need to sort of sketch out to do this? So I break the topics down into chapters. And then I write what I call an outline of each chapter. Now, here's what I mean by an outline. I don't mean Roman numeral 1 heading ABC, Roman numeral 2 heading, and so forth. Like everybody else, I was forced to do that in high school, hated it, never wanted to do it again. So what I mean by an outline is I would take a topic for a chapter and basically write a free-form summary, almost like an abstract, of what I expect to cover in that chapter. And typically it would be like 1 to 2, maybe 3 single-space pages. And when I have every chapter outlined in that form, I figure, okay, now at this point I'm ready to show it to somebody. And in my particular case, I am blessed with a literary agent, a guy who's worked with my textbook co-author, Joe Levine, and me for years. I'll give him a plug. He's in New York City. His name is Barney Karpfinger. Carp like the fish and finger like one of the things at the end of your hand. And Barney is a terrific guy because he is so incredibly critical. And every time I've come up with an idea for a trade book and got to the outline stage, I've sent it to Barney, and Barney's just tore it apart. She said, oh, it's terrible. You know, the general gist of what you want to do is this, but you're off on a tangent here, or, you know, this is only going to appeal to a certain limited audience. You don't want to do that, and so forth. And I think Barney and I bounced around the outlines and the phrasing and everything else probably for about 18 months. A lot of criticism for me, a lot of false starts. And finally he got to the point where he said, you know what? I think you might have something that I, meaning my agent, can show to publishers. And at that point, he would have me polish that outline. It would be about 20 single-space pages at that point. And then he would show it to a number of publishers. And at that point, they could sort of see what this book was going to be like. And at that point, the several publishers made a bid. The one that I decided I wanted to work with was from Simon & Schuster. I have, I now say, after working with her for about a year and a half, a wonderful editor named Priscilla Paynton. And Priscilla loved the whole idea of the book. She loved that outline. But on the other hand, she had a lot of problems with some of those particular chapters. And in some cases, I said, no, I don't want to go there. But in other cases, I said, oh, that's brilliant, and altered what I wanted to do. And at that point, I would simply sit down and say, okay, I'm writing on free will. I know kind of where I want to go. But now I have to sit down, and I have to read everything important written about free will in the last couple of years, which I did assiduously. And my bookshelf just hypertrophied. You can see this in the bibliography of the book. And I just read and read and read. And I'll give you one other example of something that to me as a cell biologist was a new topic, and that was consciousness. There's an enormous literature on consciousness going all the way back to René Descartes. And I read as much of that as I possibly could. I came across one book that really sort of set me back and made me think. And I came across this book because I was asked to write a review of it for the magazine Commonweal. Now, the book was written by the very distinguished NYU philosopher Thomas Nagel, and it is called Mind and Cosmos. But what really piqued my interest was the subtitle of the book. And the subtitle was Why the Neo-Darwinian Theory of Evolution is Almost Certainly Wrong. And I thought, whoa, I got to read this book. Now, it's only about 120 pages, but it is written by a philosopher. Therefore, for me as a biologist, it's tough reading. But it's really well worth it. And I dug into it, and parts of it I was quite critical of, but the general gist of it just impressed the heck out of me. And as I worked in the chapter of consciousness, reading articles and papers and scientific literature, I finally decided reading Nagel's book is not enough. I got to talk to this guy. So I emailed Professor Nagel at NYU, where he still teaches. And to my absolute astonishment, he wrote me back within an hour. He said, I know who you are. And rather than talk over the phone, why don't you come down to New York City and I'll buy you lunch and we'll have a nice chat. And to my astonishment, I went down to New York City. I met him at what he told me was his favorite restaurant to have lunch in. He paid for lunch. God, this is so generous. And we talked not just through lunch, but for almost 3 hours in the restaurant. And I came away from that still disagreeing with Nagel on certain points, but profoundly impressed by his thoughtfulness, the issues that really drive him. He considers himself a moral realist, and that's his particular problem because he believes that the moral implication of human evolution is that morals are not real. They're not authentic. Moral values are not authentic. They're simply shaped by evolution, and hence they have no validity. And to him as a philosopher, he finds that repellent. And I should also add, for your listeners who don't know Thomas Nagel, he believes that not for religious reasons. And in fact, he's an outspoken atheist. It's just that he thinks that good and evil are real, that there is such a thing as right and wrong. And he thinks that philosophers have a duty to find and define what is right and wrong in terms of behavior and morality. So anyway, that's my writing process. And I would like a lot of people, there are some days, nothing works. And there are other days when I would sit down and the ideas that I've been thinking about and I slept on last night, man, they just come right out. And the other thing I would mention is that over the years, I have discovered that as the day goes on, I get stupider as the day goes longer. And therefore, all of my good writing is sometime between dawn and 12 noon. And I know other people who can't write until it's late at night. And sooner or later, if you are going to write repeatedly, or if you're going to write for a living, I'm certainly not someone who makes their living as a writer. You really have to understand your own intellectual rhythms. And in my case, writing in the morning is what works for me.
Yeah, that's great. And I totally agree. I'm definitely a night person. Which is difficult because I feel like most of society is sort of set up for morning people. School set up to start early. Everything people kind of revolve around that. But
so therefore, you have a sense of persecution as a night people that
yes.
us morning people are picking on you.
Yes, exactly. My whole life.
Okay, well, that's the way my wife feels.
Okay,
so there it is. Okay, but go ahead.
So just let's get into the book a bit. I mean, so you already kind of brought this up, but generally, a lot of people seem to have a problem with evolution as it relates to humans specifically. And you kind of mentioned this, how there were some polls done and people didn't mind evolution as long as it touched on just that other plants or other animals are somehow connected. But when it comes to us, all of a sudden, it's not. I don't want that. Can't be right. So I'm really curious about that. And, you mentioned religion is probably a strong reason why.
I would say the strongest reason why, but not the
strongest reason why.
Yeah, but not the only one.
Yeah, or maybe, like you said, other people, it's just kind of a strange idea to think about. Like, I don't really see, I look at a chimpanzee, I don't see me. So yeah, maybe just trying to understand that, why is it that religion has such a grip on people's minds that they're having trouble, flipping that switch, and kind of what role do all the different other people in society have? So this religions, philosophers, scientists, what role do all those people have in getting everyone on the same page? Should the heads of religion be pushing for evolution to be accepted? Should philosophers, should scientists be doing this?
Well, when you talk about getting everyone on the same page, actually, that sounds kind of scary to me. It is totalitarian societies that get everyone on the same page, often by means that we would find repugnant in a democratic society. Freedom to disagree is important. And I think it's important. I even as a scientist, I certainly don't want people compelled to accept a scientific narrative. I want them to understand science and to be exposed to it. With respect to religious faith, I got it easy as a Catholic. And the reason for that is no fewer than 4 popes, beginning with Pius XII, have written in support of evolution. So that, in fact, the latest pope, Pope Francis, many people know wonderful things about Francis. I'll tell you, from a Catholic point of view, the single most revolutionary thing about Pope Francis that was just jaw-dropping is he's a Jesuit. That's a society within the church. There has never been a Jesuit pope. The church establishment has always been really suspicious of the Jesuits because they're a very powerful order. And if you ever find a priest who is also a scientist, and there are lots of examples of that, almost all of them are Jesuits. And that's an interesting thing. Now, Pope Francis himself, as a young man, was actually trained as a chemist. So he had scientific training before he went into the seminary. And at one point a few years ago, he was asked, is it possible for a Catholic to accept scientific ideas like evolution and the Big Bang? And he just shrugged. And he said, God is not a magician with a magic wand, and evolution and the Big Bang are real. And we should come to understand that. And that's the current Pope. John Paul II said much the same thing. Benedict XVI said much the same thing. So that's pretty easy. The biggest problem in the U.S. with respect to religious conflict with evolution is fundamentalist Christianity. And there are many American Christians who believe that an interpretation that every word of the Bible must be literally true in the historic and the scientific sense. There are many people, that's my dog sort of lending a little background noise. There are many people who think that's a traditional Christian point of view. It's not. Christian fundamentalism arose in the United States in the late 1800s. It's not part of traditional Christianity, and therefore it's sort of an American invention that the Bible has to be a scientific document. And one of the points I always try to make as a Christian to fellow Christians who feel that way is they think that to demand that the Bible be scientific elevates the Bible. I'm a scientist. To call it a scientific document profanes it, because everything in science is subject to disproof, to dispute, to rechecking, to fact-checking, to other experimentations. And if you say something is a scientific document, that's not synonymous with truth. That simply means it's an empirical document. And Christians have always understood the books of the Bible to be works of spirituality and not works of science. As I like to tell my friends, what did Jesus come here for? Did he come here to teach us differential calculus and special relativity, or did he come here to save our souls? And I think they know the right answer.
So, yeah, and you already mentioned evolutionary psychology briefly, and you talk about how it's really interesting because you talk a bit about how it's controversial, and it's able to assert itself kind of everywhere, and sort of in one sense that it suggests that everything about us, our most intimate thoughts, our goals, our values, our morals, they're not really ours. They're the artifacts of thousands of generations of natural selection and kind of exerting this power that's beyond our ability to control.
Right.
So this is kind of a crazy thought. And again, this harkens back, why is evolution very difficult for people? I can see why evolutionary psychology is thus similarly difficult. So when we think about that idea, what are the ramifications of that for our sense of self and what it means to be human? And, kind of how does that play into people's fears about that idea?
Well, first of all, let me make very clear. I don't want to slur and slander an entire field. I could say something cliched like some of my best friends are evolutionary psychologists. By the way, that happens to be true. So there's an awful lot in evolutionary psychology that's valuable. And what evolutionary psychology really is the application of evolutionary principles to understand human psychology. We are evolved creatures. The brain is a physical organ. And the way our brain works has certainly been shaped, at least in part, by the forces of natural selection during the evolution of our species. That's a no-brainer. That's easy. That's easy to understand. What I object to and what I'm concerned about is the tendency of many people within the field of evolutionary psychology to overstate things, basically to make up just so stories for why we human beings do what we do, based on flimsy evidence or basically, or more properly based on speculation, based in the principles of evolution. And I can give you just two examples that I put in the book. My favorite one, it's almost facetious, but it's just so ridiculous, is a flurry of articles that began to appear a few years ago on why women like going shopping more than men do. And there's a whole series of articles as why women hate to shop, why men hate to ask for directions. And a number of people were content to make up stories and say that the reason women like to go shopping and men don't is because back in the Pleistocene, a million and a half years ago when our species was evolving, the women, of course, were staying home, taking care of the caves, keeping them clean, and going out locally to gather vegetables, fruits, other things. And that's kind of like shopping. It takes a long time. You have to be careful at it. You have to compare this, that, and the other thing. Whereas the men were going out on the hunt. And when they go out on the hunt, they want to find that critter and kill the critter quickly and bring it right back. So therefore, that's why when men go shopping, they just want to find that shirt or that suit jacket or that new tire, get it right away and get the hell out of the mall. Whereas the women, they delight in going from store to store and so forth. Well, that's absurd. There are a lot of men who like to shop. There are a lot of women who don't. But two problems with it. One is we really don't know what the gender roles were of our species 1.5 million years ago. So when you say, here's what the women were doing and here's what the men were doing, you don't know that. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I'm a biologist. If you want to argue that how one feels about shopping is somehow ingrained in our DNA, I'll accept that. But could you please show me the gene the DNA sequence, the haplotype that correlates with liking shopping as opposed to the haplotype that doesn't. Well, of course, there's no such evidence. And then finally, all these just so stories made up to explain how they think men and women behave today completely overlook the fact that all of us grow up certainly in a culture like the United States, saturated with advertising and literature and movies that reinforces certain stereotypical gender roles. So the notion that maybe women do like to shop a little more than men, but it's not as though they haven't seen a ton of advertising that suggests to them that that's exactly how they should behave. So to attribute all of this to evolutionary genetics strikes me as absurd. So that's the
So it sounds like what you're saying is that evolutionary psychology is useful, but sometimes it goes too far, can be twisted by people in the wrong way.
Yeah, there are a lot of people in evolutionary psychology who have sort of gotten out ahead of their skis, okay, more than the evidence can do. And the other example that I actually opened a chapter in the book with was another book that came out a number of years ago called A Natural History of Rape. And in that book, the authors argued that, again, we're back in the Pleistocene again, that the behavior to rape, and what I mean by that is to sexually assault, to force oneself on women, and so forth, that behavior is probably ingrained in our genome. And the reason it's there is, back in the Pleistocene, men who had genes for that behavior were more successful in producing children than men who didn't have it. Now, the argument then is, if there are men who rape a lot of women, they get some of them pregnant, they produce children. If that's a genetic tendency, those male children will also have that tendency. And that's why this gene spread throughout our culture. 2 or 3 problems with this. Biggest problem is, please, where's the gene? Where's the DNA sequence? Show me that this is for real. Number 2, all of us grow up in a culture in which, for better or for worse, there are stereotypical roles and expectations for both men and women. And to pretend that a behavior like sexual assault has no cultural basis is naive in the extreme. And then finally, the researchers who advocated this point of view really didn't do the kind of research that you should do if you wanted to make the case for this. And here's what I mean. You really have to find a primitive or semi-primitive society in which you could actually estimate the cost-benefit ratio of forcible sexual assault. And it turns out other investigators prompted by this book did exactly that. And they found a number of fairly primitive tribal cultures in South America, and basically carried out cultural investigations in terms of how does this particular society treat sexual assault? How do they treat someone who rapes or is suspected of rape? And they realized something, and that is rape occurs in all human cultures. When this happened in several of these cultures, or one in particular, it's not like it's a deed that goes unpunished. The rapist, in the act of raping, puts himself at considerable risk. The woman might fight back, and she might fight back with lethal force. Even if she doesn't, her family might fight back to protect her honor. They may attack the rapist. And then the other thing, and this is basic biology, women are not fertile 100% of the time. And in fact, during a 28-day menstrual period, typically women can only conceive about 4 of those 28 days. So even if you make a practice of forcing yourself on women, you're only going to have a shot at producing a pregnancy at a small fraction of the times that you execute this deed, while the danger of retaliation is there from every single one of them. And when a particular investigator investigated those, he came to the conclusion that that rape was not an evolutionarily stable strategy, that the costs of this behavior were actually greater than the reproductive benefits. So the entire hypothesis was, again, based on a just so story rather than based on sound science. And those are the studies in evolutionary psychology I take issue with. It still is a useful science. It still tells us a lot about ourselves. But to pretend that you can understand everything about humans and human behavior by implying that these behaviors were selected for by evolution, I think is naive in the extreme.
Mm. Yeah, and kind of related to that, I wanted to go back to the idea or talk a bit about the idea of interpretations. And there's like you said with a couple of these different areas, there's many ways to think about and interpret findings. And so an example that kind of popped out at me was this the hominid skulls at the Dmanisi, maybe?
That's correct. Yeah,
Dmanisi
that's right.
site.
Yeah, they
found these hominid skulls.
This is a region in the country of Georgia where some very, very interesting human or pre-human skulls were found. Go ahead.
Yeah. So, and there was kind of some confusion about what they meant initially, and so scientists kind of conferred, and different scientists came up with some possible different ideas, and those different thoughts probably were based on their own history and what they had done before, and so they had their own kind of bias about what might be right or wrong.
Sure.
And then separately, creationists came in and tried to spin it, their own special way, and they came up with their own, meaning for that. And maybe there was some discussion even amongst creationists what it actually the correct interpretation was. I mean, it's interesting to just compare the two in the sense that we all have biases, and even scientists that are coming up with solutions, those solutions are rooted in biases.
Of course.
And so it's just very interesting to me to think about that everybody is kind of doing things now with that hopefully in mind, but maybe not. So I guess my question was, what is a good way of thinking about that? How can we try and shed the biases and be as objective as possible? And should we expect different interpretations?
Yes. Well, first of all, you should expect different interpretations. I know a few paleontologists, and the great temptation of every paleontologist is to pronounce the fossil that they personally have just discovered as the most important one ever. Yeah. So inevitably, the old thing about the missing link and so forth, everybody wants to say, hey, that thing I just dug up, I found it. It's the missing link. Well, a reasonably well-informed and circumspect human anthropologist will tell you, we have found the missing link over and over and over again. We have an abundance of riches in the pre-human fossil record. So the real question is not, are there fossils that link us to our pre-human ancestors? There sure as heck are, and we find more every single year. The question as we find these fossils is how to order them, meaning which of them is in the direct line of ancestry to us, which is a cousin branching off to the side, or which is a truly distant relative. And that's kind of hard to tell. Fossils didn't keep genealogy books. So we have to fund this by objective criteria. Now, you mentioned that everybody has their own biases. That's absolutely true. It's true with everybody in science. I like to say that science prospers not because it appeals to the best in human nature, but because it appeals to the worst. It appeals to greed, avarice, the desire for fame, the desire to get ahead in academia, the desire to get promoted. But everybody has that desire. And the great thing about science is, if you look at the scientific records of the Dmanisi fossils, you'll quickly see that after they were discovered, they were extensively characterized in terms of measurements, structure, composition, the geological layers in which they were found, other fossils that were found nearby. And all of that material is made public for everyone to pore over and everyone to analyze. And what this allows the scientific community to do is basically for everyone else to criticize everybody else's work. The people in your own field are your most severe critics. And if fundamental errors of interpretation are made by people who find these fossils and really want them to be important, you're going to have competitors, we call them colleagues, you're going to have competitors who will just savage and will tear into you. And what you hope is from the very openness of the scientific community, you're eventually going to arrive at the truth. Now, in the case of the Dmanisi fossils, they were absolutely extraordinary in terms of representing the diversity of skull shape and size in a single community of human beings at a point in Asia that we actually didn't realize had been colonized by pre-human ancestors at the time. No one has disputed that. There's been some argument as to exactly where to place these specimens, again, in the main line or the cousins off to the side. But that interpretation has proceeded in a very straightforward and a very open way. A lot of arguments, but they're all arguments made within the context of science itself. So I wouldn't pretend for a second that scientists are any better, any more honest than anybody else. But it's the openness of the scientific process that assures us that sometimes we take a step backwards, sometimes a step sideways, but eventually we take two steps forward. And that's one of the reasons why the scientific enterprise over the centuries has been so successful.
Yeah. So I want to get a little bit more towards the mind, the brain, consciousness, and free will a bit now. So let's start off with this idea of the triune brain. So you write in the 60s, Paul MacLean described the evolution of this triune brain. So maybe talk a bit about that and how the different layers of the brain change in relative size and ability as
Sure.
the brain size increases.
Yeah, well, his idea basically was that when you look at the brain, the human brain, what you see is not an organ that was sort of designed single purpose or put together with for a concerted by a concerted process of design. But what you see deep down, sort of in what we call the brain stem, are areas that are shared not just by us and not by other mammals, but even by reptiles and fish. And these are areas that coordinate the basic functions in the body, coordinate the muscles, control breathing, control circulation. We're not even aware that they're there. And as mammals evolved, mammals have, nervous systems that are more highly developed than most other groups of animals. And what has happened is that basic reptilian framework has then had new nervous tissue added on top of it. And when we move into the primates, we have still more. So the human brain is layer after layer, and his idea was that there are three basic layers. That was a bit naive. It's really more complicated than that. There are multiples times three in terms of the layers of the brain. But the important thing to realize is that the brain itself is sort of like clunky old software in a business. And you'd like to think every now and then you throw that software out and you design a new information processing system from scratch. Well, evolution can't do that. Evolution can't throw out the old brain and say, let's get a new one that's perfectly suited to our needs. So in a way, it's like that clunky old software that has been patched here, patched there, a new capability added, errors detected, and new modules or routines added to try to correct the errors. And that's what the brain is. Gary Marcus of NYU wrote a wonderful book called Klooge. And I think the subtitle was something like The Haphazard Construction of the Human Brain. Klooge, of course, is a word that CS people use for an awkward, inefficient, and poorly designed computer program. When I took computer programming in college, and this is way back in the 60s, very simple programming in COBOL and Fortran, I passed the course, but when I showed my programs to the teaching assistants, one of them would always shake their heads and say, man, Miller, your programs are a real klooge, meaning I hadn't found a simple and elegant way to write the program. My programs had unnecessary steps. They were awkward and so forth. Well, the human brain is a klooge too. And because of that haphazard construction, meaning new capabilities added while the old ones are still there, our brains are pretty unreliable instruments. All you have to do is look at optical illusions to see how our perceptions can be fooled. There are things such as acoustic illusions. We have a tendency, basically, when we're forming opinions, to have the last person that speaks to us or the last book we've read be more influential than ones we read earlier, regardless of the strength or logic of those opinions. I think our current president is actually a good example of that. The joke about President Trump is the opinion he expresses is whatever the last person who spoke to him told him. But that's actually a universal tendency among us, and we understand that. For all of that haphazard construction, for all the flows of the brain, I love the way that Marcus ended his book, which is, yes, the brain is a klooge, but here's the deal. The interesting thing about the human brain is that the human brain has been able to investigate itself to the point where it understands the errors that it makes. And as a result of that, by knowing neuroscience and by knowing our own tendencies, as he put it, we can outwit our inner klooge. And I'm pretty sure we're the only animal that can do that in terms of understanding the errors that we are likely to make in logic and perception, and then we are able to compensate for them.
Yeah, so that's actually that sort of gets into my very next question, which was that what you just said right there. I mean, you essentially wrote something exactly to that effect, by being able to analyze our imperfections and overcome them. This is the thing that makes the human animal unique. So I guess my pushback would be, how do we really know that? When we give certain cognitive tests to a gorilla or chimpanzee or something that's related to us, and they are seemingly able to solve
Oh,
problems,
they can solve problems. Yeah.
or make tools, or they didn't have before. So they're creating new things. And there are animals that are reacting to things humans do and creating new behaviors. I think we've seen there's some, maybe dolphins or other animals create new behaviors because of humans. So there's some stuff happening there. And the trick here is that, obviously we can never, this is like the whole what's it like to be a bat thing. We can never really get inside
Right.
and know what's happening. So how are we able to say with certainty that other animals aren't doing that?
Okay. Well, here's the way in which I would put it. First of all, I
Yeah.
completely agree. Other animals can make tools. Other animals can do a kind of reasoning. Other animals are self-aware. Studies have shown that dolphins can look in a mirror and realize it's them. And the test for that typically is you put a mark somewhere on an animal's body. And when it looks in the mirror and sees the mark, it knows that mark is on them, and it turns to see it or remove it. That shows self-awareness, as opposed to just looking at a mirror and seeing another animal and not realizing it's you. Dolphins pass that test. So do some of the primates. Lots of animals can make tools. Chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans can do that. But you know what? So can crows. Crows are able to fashion tools and solve problems and so forth. So none of these properties is absolutely unique to human beings. However, there is no other species that has even come close to the things that we do in terms of, yes, other species can communicate. They don't make literature. They don't write poetry. Show me the animal that has written the Iliad or the Odyssey. Yes, other animals fashion beautiful things that we can look at as having artistic value. But show me the animal that has painted the Mona Lisa or has constructed abstract art the way that Picasso did, or impressionist art the way that Manet does. And then finally, animals can reason. They have great perception. They can intuit things that are really beyond our ability to understand. But show me an animal that has created a systematic culture of science and scientific investigation. And the answer is they're simply not there. One of my colleagues asked me, when I said only human beings have this extraordinary ability to investigate ourselves and to understand our own origins. We are the species that discovered evolution. I'm not convinced any other species had. And the colleague asked me, well, how do you know that chimpanzees and orangutans haven't discovered evolution too? And my answer to that is a quote from the late Carl Sagan. And that is, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So if you'd like to claim that chimpanzees are aware of the evolutionary history of the great apes and the other primates, just give me the evidence for it. I don't think there is any such evidence, and therefore I'm entitled to be skeptical of that. On the other hand, I have very strong evidence that human beings did discover the evolutionary process, and I can point to several books.
Yeah. So, and maybe the way in which we are able to ponder these issues and overcome our imperfections is consciousness. So maybe then we can kind of segue into talking about consciousness. And I think one of the first things you mentioned in the book is the split between the easy and the hard problems of consciousness. So maybe just talk a little bit, let people know, kind of exactly what those are, and how close are we to solving the easy and hard problems?
I began by thinking, I began by taking up the issue that many people think that evolution denies human consciousness and says that consciousness is not real. I think consciousness is authentic. The very fact that we can talk about it shows that we are conscious beings. And by consciousness, I mean, of course, self-awareness and an understanding of the reasoning process that goes on inside our heads. Now, I'm perfectly willing to admit that lots of other animals are probably conscious too. My pet dog is sitting beside me right here, and I think he's pretty conscious as well. And I think any number of animals are in that respect. But the point that I want to make is that if we are truly conscious, and I certainly think we are, that consciousness was produced by the evolutionary process. So the notion that many people maintain that acknowledging our evolutionary ancestry denies the authenticity of human consciousness, I regard simply as bogus. I think consciousness is a real thing. Now, as you mentioned, there's the hard problem and there's the easy problem. And the easy problem, first of all, is can we understand, can we in the future learn enough about the brain to understand how the brain perceives the world around it? How does it see red when it sees red? How does it perceive heat? How does it perceive sound? I think we're very close to answering those questions, and even more complicated ones, which is how does the brain know where it is in 2- and 3-dimensional space? We actually understand that the brain creates a neurological representation, if you will, a little map inside the brain, where certain neurons represent certain areas on what we might call a map. And that map is laid out in the exact same way that the real world, as we perceive it, is laid out. That sounds difficult, but that's actually what we call the easy problem. And the easy problem basically is how does the brain construct and interpret perceptions and that sort of thing. And I think neuroscience is going to solve that. To solve it might take another 100 years of research, but I have every reason to believe that it's within the competence of neuroscience to get. The really hard problem may ultimately be insoluble. And what I mean by that is how does another animal or how does another human being feel that internal movie that we all have when it perceives something? And I remember wondering as a little kid, when I saw the color red, and you close your eyes, you can imagine the color red. How do I know that when you close your eyes, you see the same red as I do? Maybe the thing that I'm calling red actually looks green to you, but you don't know enough to call it green for the very simple reason that you've always been told that is red. And I'll put it one more way, and that is we cannot see ultraviolet light. Birds can. Now, birds see the same visible colors that we do. What color is ultraviolet to them? We can't even conceive of what another color would be like. To us, the spectrum is every color that there is. There's a wonderful line from the song, I'm trying to remember who did, I think Steppenwolf, that is the opening theme for the movie Easy Rider from way back in the 60s. And there's a line in there that talks about drops of rain hanging on the trees and breaks the light to colors that no one knows the names of. That's the line, and I just absolutely love that, the idea of colors that no one knows the names of. Well, there are other organisms that can perceive in the ultraviolet and infrared. What does that look like to them? That's the hard problem, is recreating individual experience. We may never be able to solve that.
And so let's wrap up and talk about free will, the last part of the book.
Fair enough.
So, you mentioned free will. You mentioned you bring up some of the biggest thinkers. Dennett and Harris and their beliefs. So, where would you say that your vision of of where we stand on that issue is, and how does it relate in sort of the canon?
Well, I think we have free will, and I think that not because it's a religious imperative. Many Western religions teach we have free will. We can choose to sin or not to sin. We can choose between good and evil and so forth. To me, free will basically is an affirmation that we can, as reasoning beings, take facts into account about just about anything and come to a decision based on those facts, and that we are able to do so freely. I'm an advocate for free will, not because I have identified a neurological mechanism by which free choice is made. I am absolutely convinced that everything that happens in the brain, meaning everything that happens in the mind, is explicable in terms of the laws of physics and chemistry and the cell biology connections within the brain itself. So I'm not a mythicist in terms of thinking that something very spooky is happening up there between our ears that requires something ethereal like a soul to explain. Even though as a Christian I believe in the soul, it's not the soul that's reasoning, it's our brains and our nervous system that are doing the reasoning. The reason I believe in free will is because, frankly, science depends upon it. And I'll try to describe what I mean by that. All of science is predicated on the idea that we can conduct experiments, make observations, and construct hypotheses, and then accept or reject them on the basis of the evidence. In a deterministic world, whether or not we would accept evidence as indicating something is true or false would actually be determined by the prior conditions of existence, the prior conditions of our brain. And therefore, we would actually have no reason for believing that it was true or false. No less a figure than Stephen Hawking, the late Stephen Hawking, not a religious person, pointed something else. And that is, he had spent all his life seeking a final theory. And a final theory that would not only explain the origin of the universe, but also would explain everything that has happened since. If we lack free will, meaning we also lack individual judgment, the ability to make choices, then as he realized that final theory would determine everything that has happened since the Big Bang, meaning it would determine every thought that you and I had ever had, and therefore that theory would determine whether or not we regarded the theory itself as true. And how would we know that that final unifying theory would not mislead us and have us believe that something that was actually false was true, because deterministic forces were forcing us to choose it as to be true. And therefore, I think ultimately free will basically is the cornerstone of science itself. And the curious thing about Sam Harris's marvelous book entitled Free Will is that towards the end of the book, Dr. Harris himself realizes that he has to explain why he wrote this book. And remember, he's advocating that he doesn't have free will. He then has to come up with a reason why he wrote it, and why it's important for his readers, who presumably also lack free will, to come to the conclusion that they lack free will, because it will improve their lives and the quality of society. And there's something, to me, deeply paradoxical about advocating for free will to people who you don't think have it, asking them to come to a free judgment that they lack free will because it will improve their lives. And ultimately, the last 3 or 4 pages of that short book are actually pretty funny, because Dr. Harris really can't explain why he wrote the book, and he even cannot explain why he's ending it at that point. And he simply says, I've decided that I will go have something to drink, end of the book. And that is the paradox which a denial of free will leads you into, which is basically depriving yourself of free will. You might say, well, that gets the spookiness out of decision-making in the nervous system, fair enough. But it also means basically that science itself, the process by which you might have concluded that we lack free will, it also means that basically you are not free to make that conclusion. And that leads you to a paradox that ultimately is self-defeating.
Yeah. That is absolutely fascinating, and I really enjoyed that part, and especially that counterpoint. And I definitely want to go read Dr. Harris's book.
Oh, I'd recommend
just
it.
To see.
I'd recommend it. He's a good writer, and it's very well argued.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's going to have to be it. And I just want to say again, Ken, thank you so much for giving your time today. The book is The Human Instinct: How We Evolved to Have Reason, Consciousness, and Free Will. And I'm here with Ken Miller. And we've barely scratched the surface. This book goes way more in depth about evolution, consciousness, free will, and it's an absolutely fascinating read. Thanks so much for joining me, Ken.
John, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Read, Learn, Live. If you liked it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. If you hated it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. And so it goes.